Alright, we're going to continue our lecture discussion of the nervous system, picking up with the spinal cord. Last time we talked about action potentials, and hopefully you printed off the handout located under the participation assignments tab on Blackboard and filled out that diagram of the action potential. There is an answer key posted for filling out that diagram. Be sure that you check your answer key and copy all the information as you see on that diagram. So the spinal cord. Spinal cord is, remember, part of the central nervous system. It's the information that's carried from, or it's the highway for information carried from the peripheral nerves going to and from the brain. Sometimes, though, the spinal cord itself can give a response that does not involve the brain, and those are what we call reflexes. So someone taps your knee with a hammer and stimulates that reflex. The information goes into the spinal cord from the nerve. The spinal cord in turn has an interneuron involved where it turns right back around and gives a response to cause the leg to kick out. And this is shown on page 233 of your textbook, the interneuron, and we'll talk about that in a little bit more detail. So if we look at the spinal cord, then it begins at the base of the brain. It's continuous with the medulla oblongata, and then it has several areas where it's wider. We see here in the neck region and in the lumbar region it's wider because there's a lot more nerves, a lot more activity coming to and from in these areas, because we have the arms in this region and the faces, or the nerves of the neck that are important in this region, and in the lumbar region we have all the nerves going to and from the legs. But it is not the same length. The spinal cord is not the same length as the spine. Notice that it ends right about here, the length of the spinal cord, and then that we have these nerves that come off that is called the cauda equina. But the actual end of the spinal cord is right here, right at the bottom, just right at the bottom of your, how far would I say, just a few inches past your ribs. So it's not as long as the spine is. And then we have these long nerves, again, that make up the cauda equina. So it's not uniform in its diameter. It has some enlarged, thicker areas, and it's not the same length as the spinal column, the vertebrae. So looking at a cross-section of the spinal cord, you have a handout on the nervous system. We already filled out one together that was of the neuron. Now we have the spinal cord diagram to fill out. So in looking at this diagram of the spinal cord, we can see we have the dorsal root here on the back side of the spinal cord here, and this is the ventral root. Information that comes into the spinal cord, sensory afferent information, always comes in through the spinal nerve, and then it divides when it gets close to the spinal cord, and that information goes into the spinal cord via the dorsal root. There's a swelling here on the dorsal root called the dorsal root ganglion. So this whole piece here is called the dorsal root. It's the root of the spinal nerve. There's a ventral root and a dorsal root. So the whole piece is a dorsal root, but that swelling is called the dorsal root ganglion. It's a collection of cell bodies inside there that contributes to that swelling. So sensory afferent information comes in and divides and goes to the back side of the spinal cord, and that neuron ends at the dorsal horn. So on the back there's this gray matter in the center of the spinal cord, and the back portion of it is called the dorsal horn, and that's where that sensory information is coming into the spinal cord. The other root of this spinal nerve is called the ventral root, and this root is carrying information from the spinal cord away from the spinal cord to the nerves out to give a response from the central nervous system. So the dorsal root is sensory afferent information coming into the spinal cord, and the ventral root is carrying motor efferent information leaving the spinal cord. So if we look at a typical spinal nerve, we call it a mixed nerve because it's carrying both incoming information and outgoing information. That information doesn't divide until we get closer to the spinal cord into the dorsal and ventral roots. So we have the dorsal horn of the gray matter that receives this sensory afferent information. Then that information travels up the spinal cord to the brain. The brain elicits a response. That information comes down the spinal cord to the ventral horn, which is here on the front side of the spinal cord. And again, that information leaves via the ventral root. So we have information coming in, going up, coming back down to the ventral horn, out the ventral root. So what we see in the case of a reflex, which is shown on page 233 of your textbook, is a special neuron in between the dorsal horn and the ventral horn, so we don't require the brain to be involved. It doesn't have to travel up the spinal cord. That information, as it comes in through the dorsal root to the dorsal horn, it jumps right over to the ventral horn and out the ventral root. And the special neuron that connects the ventral horn to the connects the dorsal horn to the ventral horn is called an interneuron, and that's again shown on page 233 of your textbook. Also in the spinal cord we have these regions of white matter. We call these columns, and they are made up of myelinated axons that travel up and down the length of the spinal cord. So that's what carries information from the dorsal horn or to the ventral horn. It's through these areas of white matter called columns. So this would be the posterior column on the back side of the spinal cord. This would be the anterior column on the front of the spinal cord. And here on the sides would be the lateral columns on the side of the spinal cord. Just as we have a lateral horn, you can see this piece coming out here on the gray matter. These are the lateral horns. So again, if we can define these horns in terms of the information that they process and deal with, the dorsal horn receives sensory afferent information. The lateral horn carries motor autonomic information traveling out of the spinal cord, and the ventral horn carries somatic motor information out of the spinal cord. And then again, all through the ventral root, the lateral and the ventral horns, those neurons leave via the ventral root. In the center of the spinal cord is a small hole that just has cerebrospinal fluid, and that bathes the nervous tissue in the center of the spinal cord. So that's the central canal carrying that cerebrospinal fluid. And on the surface of the spinal cord, we have the same thing as we saw in the brain. We have three protective layers. The most superficial, toughest outer layer is the dura mater, and that's what's shown here. This is the dura mater. It's a tough, protective layer. The term dura, you've heard durable, that means tough, and mater in Latin means mother. So the dura mater is the tough mother. It protects the spinal cord and the brain. So here's the brain tissue. Here we see the dura mater, this two-layered membrane here. Then the next layer is the arachnoid mater. The arachnoid mater is this next layer, and it has some spidery extensions that come off of it, and under the arachnoid mater is where cerebrospinal fluid is located. So this kind of beige, or I should say whitish layer with the wispy extensions, that's the arachnoid mater, and that means spidery mother, and these wispy extensions is where the word spidery comes from for arachnoid. So this is the arachnoid mater, and underneath that is where the cerebrospinal fluid is located. So we call the space underneath the arachnoid mater where we find cerebrospinal fluid, we call that the subarachnoid space. The pia mater is a very thin, delicate membrane, and it's adhered directly to the brain matter, the brain tissue itself, and we call that the pia mater. Pia means affectionate, so affectionate mother. So that's tightly adhered right to the brain tissue itself, dipping down into the sulcus and up over the gyri, tightly adhered. So we talked about the reflex arc. When a doctor taps a child's knee with a hammer, it brings sensory afferent information into the spinal cord through the dorsal root to the dorsal horn. Here's a dorsal horn, and here's that interneuron. It's a special neuron that communicates between the dorsal horn and the ventral horn. So that information jumps right across the spinal cord to give a response right back out via the ventral horn through the ventral root. This motor neuron travels through there to cause the muscle to contract. So this is a reflex arc, and the arc comes into play with the interneuron. It's just taking the information from the sensory pathway to the motor pathway and giving a quick response. And reflexes are helpful because they allow us to respond quickly to injury. For example, if you touch something hot or step on something sharp. So it's important to know the different terms. Sensory receptor would be out here in the skin. That if you poke yourself with a pin, the sensory receptor will pick up that signal, and action potential will travel through the sensory neuron to the interneuron in the spinal cord, in the central nervous system, which will cause that action potential to travel to the motor neuron, which will carry it away from the spinal cord out to the organ that's going to cause a response. And in this case, it would be the quadriceps muscles kicking the leg outward in the case of tapping the knee with that little hammer. So we call whatever the response organ is that's going to cause the knee to kick out, or for a gland to be secreted, or hormone to be secreted, from a gland, we call that the effector organ. Whatever is giving the response, it's the effect of the stimulus, the effector organ. So again, we call this a reflex arc, and you can label that on your diagram under the participation assignments. Let's see if we can go and find that here. This is under participation assignments. It's the nervous system handout. So we have here, this would be the posterior column. This would be right here the dorsal root. This here would be the dorsal root ganglion. This here would be the spinal nerve. This here would be the ventral root. This here would be the ventral horn. And this here would be the dorsal root ganglion. Now, to name exactly, what these neurons are, this would be a sensory afferent neuron here, and this red one would be a motor efferent neuron carrying information out. So for drawing arrows, the blue neuron is carrying information into the spinal cord, and the red neuron is carrying information from the spinal cord. So your arrow should be leaving the spinal cord on the red neuron, entering on the blue neuron. So that's it for that diagram and labeling. Going back to the PowerPoint then, moving along, the peripheral nerves then are neurons, specifically the axon portion of a neuron that is bundled into a connective sheath that is myelinated. So these nerves leave the spinal cord and stimulate organs out in the periphery of the body. So a nerve is not a neuron. It's bundles of myelinated axons that are wrapped up in a connective tissue covering with blood vessels, because we know our nerves need a good blood supply in order to function properly. If you sleep on your arm or sit on your foot and on the couch, you might find numbness and tingling eventually because the blood supply to those nerves is cut off, and as a result those nerves don't function properly. So the brain and spinal cord have nerves that come off of them. We're going to talk about the parts of the brain, specifically in their functions, but just remember that nerves are carrying information to and from the central nervous system to carry out daily activities. So the brain stem is this vertical part of the brain, and it's made up of the midbrain, the pons, and the medulla oblongata. When we look at the functions of each of these parts, the midbrain is important for reflexes in terms of vision and hearing. The pons is helpful in regulating sleep as well as the rate of breathing. And the medulla, although it doesn't look like a very significant part of the brain, has a very significant role in homeostasis. It initiates the heartbeat, blood vessel diameter, breathing, swallowing, vomiting, hiccuping, coughing, sneezing. Many of those important responses that maintain homeostasis are initiated at the level of the medulla oblongata. So damage to the brainstem usually results in death because of all the important functions of the medulla. The cerebellum, that's on the back side of the brain. Remember we talked about that? Little brain coming off the back of the brainstem. That's important for balance, maintaining your body position, an involuntary control of body position, and fine motor control. For example, people that have smooth flowing movements like a ballet dancer or even a golfer would have a well-developed cerebellum. And damage to the cerebellum can result in shakiness, inability to stand up, inability to control body position in a seated or standing position. That's all damage to the cerebellum. The diencephalon is made up of several different pieces. The two important pieces we're going to talk about are the thalamus and the hypothalamus. The thalamus is in the center of the brain, if you recall from lab, and that's a relay center. And what that means is as information is coming up the spinal cord to the brain, the thalamus receives sensory information and projects it out to the other parts of the brain. So the thalamus is what we call a relay center for incoming information. It's kind of like the secretary deciding where things need to go in a business when it's receiving lots of input. So sometimes we get inappropriate responses, inappropriate emotions like fear or rage because stimuli coming in are processed at the thalamus and passed along to higher parts of the brain as important information, where necessarily, or it might not necessarily be important information. For example, a spider crawling across the desk may not initiate a huge fear response in someone because of not having a fear of spiders. But the thalamus, if it sends a fear signal in response to the spider crawling across a desk, that might be due to, genetic tendencies within the family that have, at the level of the thalamus, that passes that information on, eliciting fear, or information that would normally be coming into the brain through the thalamus in terms of things that might be upsetting can initiate rage in some individuals. So finding medications that specifically act on the thalamus is a challenge for people that deal with individuals that suffer from extreme phobias or temper control problems. The hypothalamus is this region below and anterior to the thalamus. This is an important part of the brain for homeostasis because it functions largely in controlling the autonomic nervous system as well as the endocrine system. So I'm going to talk about involuntary responses to changes in heart rate, blood pressure, breathing, hormone secretion. It's the hypothalamus that really controls that. So very, very important part of the brain for homeostasis. The cerebrum is our thinking part of our brain. So this is the wrinkled portion of the brain. We talked about the gyri and the sulcus that increases surface area for the brain, and it's divided into different lobes, and the different lobes are associated with different functions. For example, the frontal lobe is important for problem solving. The parietal lobe is important for controlling body position and voluntary movements. The temporal lobe plays an important role in hearing. The occipital lobe is important for vision. So each lobe has specific functions that are particularly related to that lobe. The basal nuclei are little portions within the brain around the thalamus. Their job is to control motor response from the body. So they also provide for smooth movements and initiating movements. People that have damage to cells of the basal nuclei have trouble initiating and stopping uncontrolled movements. So people that have a shaking hand or trouble walking forward because of an inability to initiate the footsteps or an inability to turn a door handle, that's controlled by the basal nuclei. And that's what's damaged in people with Parkinson's disease, is they have trouble initiating and controlling their movements. So tremors and shaking and walking are difficult for people with the advanced stages of Parkinson's disease. The limbic system is another several parts of the brain that work together, and they drive our emotions and basic drives. So we call that the limbic system. People that have strong tendencies, strong cravings, we can trace that back to levels functions of the limbic system. So strong cravings, strong attractions to certain individuals, emotions, all related to the limbic system. So these areas here, the corpus callosum, caudate nucleus, internal capsule, lentiform nucleus, those pieces become more active. The cells in those areas become more active when we experience extreme emotions. For example, seeing the face of a tiny kitten or looking at the face of a cute newborn causes those good feelings to be released and expressed, and that's a result of all these pieces of the limbic system working together. The ventricles of the brain are open cavities within the brain which is filled with fluid, and the fluid inside there is cerebrospinal fluid, and it circulates throughout the brain tissue, nourishing the brain tissue. Outside of our brain, we also have cerebrospinal fluid, remember, under the subarachnoid space, and that bathes the brain and takes a lot of the weight off of the brain inside the skull. So our brain is essentially floating in cerebrospinal fluid, and a lot of the mass of the brain is taken down because of being able to be essentially immersed in the cerebrospinal fluid. So it's important for us to have just the right amount of cerebrospinal fluid. If we have too much, we can end up with what's called hydrocephalus, or too much pressure on the brain if the skull bones have fused after childhood, and that can be damaging and cause brain damage. So we need just the right of cerebrospinal fluid, and it's circulated here around the thalamus, under the corpus callosum, through a special network of blood vessels called the choroid plexus, which is made up of ependymal cells and blood vessels. And the cerebrospinal fluid circulates around the thalamus, goes down into the fourth ventricle of the cerebellum, around the outside of the cerebellum, and over the top of the brain. So we can see this cerebrospinal fluid is circulated not only in the center of the brain, but down the middle of the spinal cord, around the outside of the spinal cord, and around the outside of the brain. And then it's picked up by special processes that lead to the veins, and then the veins recycle that cerebrospinal fluid, taking it out of the ventricle so more can be made to replace it. So recall that the ependymal cells are those special neuroglial cells that produce cerebrospinal fluid, and we find those here in the ventricles of the brain. So looking at the blood supply to the brain from the heart, 20% of the blood pumped from the heart goes to the brain. So we have very large vessels running up our neck to supply this large blood supply to our brain, and those are called the carotid arteries. We can feel the carotid artery when we find our voice box. Place 2 fingers on either side of your voice box, and you can feel the pulsing of blood as the heart pumps it through the carotid arteries to the brain. So we know that the brain requires a lot of blood. That's because the brain is very active. Those cells are working very hard, so it needs a good supply of oxygen and a good supply of glucose. We know that if blood sugar levels get too low, we get tired, we get sleepy, we get crabby. It's difficult to concentrate. So it's important that we're constantly supplying glucose to our brain. So it's important to eat while you're studying for a test or before you go to class, just to supply that glucose to your brain. And also oxygen. We know if we don't get enough oxygen to our brain, we'll pass out, because our cells cannot survive, our brain cells cannot survive without enough oxygen. So it's important that whenever a person is choking, that we quickly relieve that choking so we can get oxygen to the brain. So the blood-brain barrier is a description of the capillaries that serve nervous tissue in the brain, and these astrocytes wrap around those capillaries and protect them from substances leaking from the general circulation. So it really protects that brain tissue from infection that might be in the general blood supply. So we have these special foot processes of the astrocytes around the capillaries, and it's essential to keep toxins and infection out of the brain tissue. But it becomes a problem when we're trying to develop drugs that can pass through the blood-brain barrier to get to this brain tissue when we're trying to treat, for example, a mental disorder or a brain tumor. Here we can see the different paths that different molecules have to take. Things that can dissolve in water have a hard time squeezing through these tight junctions between the cells that make up the capillaries of the blood-brain barrier. So here, these are individual cells of the blood-brain barrier. Here we can see fat-soluble substances. They can diffuse right across. So things like carbon dioxide, oxygen, alcohol, those can diffuse directly across the blood-brain barrier, and those will enter nervous tissue rather easily. Here we can see glucose, amino acids, nucleosides. Those need a special transporter to get across the membrane because they're water soluble and they can't freely cross, and they're too large to fit between the cells. And the cells are tightly joined, so we see very little diffusing between the cells of the capillaries. They need special transporters. So here we can see this green protein has to be specific to these substances and transport them across the membrane. Here we see insulin has special receptors on the surface. So as insulin binds to those receptors, we see endocytosis of insulin is taken into the brain. Other substances, again, taken by endocytosis and brought into the brain tissue that way. So it has to enter these cells, crossing the capillaries through special transport mechanisms to get across. It can't freely pass through as in other parts of the body. So the somatic and autonomic nervous system are two branches of the nervous system we talked about. They're two ways that the nervous system responds to some input. So if the response involves stimulating voluntary skeletal muscle, we call that a somatic motor response. Voluntary skeletal muscle. Kicking a ball, picking up a pen, is voluntary skeletal muscle. We call that a somatic motor neuron, part of the somatic nervous system. If the response from the nervous system is to stimulate cardiac muscle, which is shown here, smooth muscle, which is shown here, or glands, we call that an autonomic motor response. Autonomic, going out the same pathway as we see in the somatic. It's going out the ventral horn through the ventral root. But the autonomic, same thing, ventral horn, ventral root, going out to the effector organ. But if that effector organ is cardiac muscle, smooth muscle, or glands, we call it an autonomic motor neuron. This is a somatic motor neuron. And there's a little bit of other differences between the two. Here we can see the somatic motor neuron is myelinated its entire length. Here we can see the autonomic motor neuron. There's two neurons. There's one here and there's one here. The first motor neuron is myelinated, but the second one is not. That allows a slower response because we don't want instant, increased heart rate, or fast hormone release, or quick smooth muscle contraction. Some of these things require a little bit of a slower response. And we did talk about that earlier when we talked about the importance of myelinated versus unmyelinated neurons. So remember, autonomic motor neuron means involuntary reactions from the body, typically maintaining homeostasis, and somatic means voluntary skeletal muscle is being stimulated. So when you look at the autonomic nervous system, that's the involuntary response. Sometimes information is coming into the body that's going to need to elicit a fight or flight response. If you see something scary, or if you're under a great deal of stress at work, you get this fight or flight response. So sympathetic, think of stress response. You're either going to stay and fight, or you're going to run away. Either way, your body's going to be prepped to do either one of those things. You're going to see an increased heart rate, increased dilation of your airways, dilation of the pupils, allowing more light to come in. It's the stress response. The parasympathetic response from the autonomic nervous system we call the rest and digest subdivision, which means you're just kind of hanging out, you're relaxed, you're digesting your dinner, so you have nice saliva production, you feel the urge to urinate, digestion is going along fine, you have the urge to have a bowel movement. That's all when the parasympathetic nervous system is dominating. So we have two types of response again through this autonomic motor neuron. We can have a parasympathetic information being carried or sympathetic. It depends on the receptors that bind to these neurotransmitters released from the end of the autonomic motor neuron. So parasympathetic versus sympathetic information is constantly in balance. We're trying to we need a little bit of parasympathetic influence and we need a little bit of sympathetic influence at all times to keep us at an even keel. But if we have a stressful situation like we see here with the snake, then we have the sympathetic nervous system dominating, which is allowing this person to prepare for stress and run away from that snake or stay and fight the snake. Here, if a person is sleeping, that's going to be dominating because everything is slowing down because the person is at rest. So it's a balance between the two branches of the autonomic nervous system to keep us in an even keel and maintain homeostasis. So here's the effect of the fight or flight response, the sympathetic response. And the important thing to understand is when we're stressed because of life events, nothing that's actively causing us to physically stay and fight, but just stress like too much work, bad relationships, money problems, housing issues, illness, all of those things can cause the stress response in our body to give undesirable effects. So having an increased heart rate is not good if we're just resting and relaxing. What else? Increased blood pressure is something that happens as a result of the stress response. That's not always a good thing if we're not fighting and flighting. If we're just sitting and watching television, increased blood pressure is damaging to the heart. Poor digestion. We tend to have poor appetite, lose weight when we're under a lot of stress. Or we have an uneasiness with this digestion and we try to feed it by eating too much. Sphincters tend to close with the fight or flight response, and as a result of that we tend to be constipated and not have regular bowel movements. The mouth feels dry because salivation goes down. People can get chest pains, palpitations, and sweating when they have an anxiety attack. That's all the sympathetic nervous system dominating. Fast, shallow breathing we call hyperventilation. That can happen when people are very stressed. And all of those things contribute to poor oxygenation and just an overall feeling of not being in balance or in homeostasis. So as we age, what do we get to look forward to? We have a decline in sensory and motor function because look at the size of the brain here. This is an extreme example, but here's a young, healthy brain. Here's a brain of a much older individual. The brain tissue actually atrophies. So as we have less functional neurons, we have less ability to receive incoming information and to respond to it. So what are the symptoms of that? Our taste buds become less sensitive, so elderly people like to have more salt on their foods. They like very, very sweet desserts because they can't taste the sweet as well as they did when they were younger. They can't smell as well, so if there's a gas leak in the house, Grandma can't smell that gas leak because she has less sensitive olfactory receptors in her nose. Vision goes down, hearing goes down. Motor function, we know we're slower. The reactions are not as quick to the sensation of falling. So we have slower reflexes. It's more easily to get burned. More easily, elderly trip more easily just because of this information highway to and from the central nervous system is slower. And the size and weight of the brain decrease. As a result, short-term memory decreases, but long-term memory is unaffected or improved. And the reason for that is, the thought is that we have a lifetime of experiences and memories that we retain and rehearse over many, many years. As a result of that, long-term memory tends to remain intact. For example, if you ask a woman in her 90s to explain to you the birthing process of her first child, she can probably tell you that with great detail because that's something that mothers usually talk about. They often rehearse it in their own minds, and it's something that's not forgotten. Or an old song that was important, maybe their wedding song when they were married. They'll remember that song, but they won't remember a song that was played earlier in the day. So those are some of the major changes of the nervous system as we age. So be sure that you go through our Blackboard folder and complete the handouts, the participation worksheets as they relate to the nervous system. There is a brief worksheet on it's called Brain Basics and Alzheimer's Disease. There is a website that you visit for the information for that. It talks about Alzheimer's and what's happening with Alzheimer's, and there's some simple questions to fill out as you watch and go through that PowerPoint. So be sure you do that and that you understand a little bit more about Alzheimer's disease. And that concludes this discussion. Thank you.